Hi, everyone. Aaron Mendes here, CEO and co-founder of Privacy Hawk, and this is our podcast on all things digital and technology and science. And the name of the podcast is actually called Through the Rabbit Hole. And we have one of my favorite guests here to talk about cybersecurity, identity theft, frauds, scams, and all that crazy stuff that we're bombarded with every day. Eva Velasquez with the Identity Theft Resource Center. It's great to have you on, Eva, and looking forward to helping our listeners and watchers become more educated so they can reduce their risk of some of these terrible scams and fraud that could happen.
You know what? It's great to be back. I always love going down the rabbit hole with you. That is an apt name for our discussions and conversations.
Yeah, exactly. There's just so many different things going on in that whole world. So why don't we start if you could just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what the Identity Theft Resource Center does.
Well, I'll start with the ITRC because the organization has been around longer than I've been the CEO. So Identity Theft Resource Center has been around for 25 years. It was started primarily as a victim services organization. So we provide direct one-on-one services to the public in the form of identity recovery, scam identification, and risk mitigation. Really anything that has to do with your identity credentials. If you have questions or problems with them, you can reach out to us and actually talk to a real person. So you can talk to them at our toll-free call center, live chat with them on our website. You can email us. You can even direct message us on social media, any way that you want to engage. But we also do a lot of consumer education, thought leadership, really trying to educate the public as well as industry, businesses, government, even policymakers about what is the right thing to do in this landscape to not only help people recover from identity crimes, but to protect them from having them occur in the first place.
Great. Yeah, and also just all of this stuff for consumers is free. It's free to call and get help if you need it, and also all of the resources you guys publish in the news and education
Mm-hmm.
is all free.
That's right. We are a 501c3 charity organization. So we're funded by government grants and donations from the public so that we can provide everything I just talked about at no cost to the people who need it.
Great. That is a great service, really valuable. So for those of you listening, you might have heard of various identity protection services like LifeLock, Privacy Hawk, our company offers one. A lot of banks offer it. There's a number of different things that these services do. One of them is they will monitor the dark web and for data breaches and notify you about that. They'll provide $1 million or even more of insurance. And they charge a lot of money for this. Like LifeLock can charge, anywhere between $150 and $300 depending on the package you get. Some of that is for the insurance, but they also offer this restoration where you can contact them and get help untangling the mess that happens if you become a victim of identity fraud. That component you can get for free from Identity Theft Resource Center, the restoration component. Is that right?
Well, to a degree, yes. And there are differences. So we're pretty agnostic when it comes to the paid identity protection services because the reality is there are some things that they can do for you that would be very difficult for you to do yourself. They're time consuming. So I understand folks that say, I don't want to spend that time writing these letters, contacting these different organizations. That is something where they can lift some of that burden, not all of it. You cannot abdicate all responsibility, but they can lift some of that burden. We don't get a power of attorney. We don't collect your PII. Instead, we walk you through the process. We're like that guide that's sitting there holding your hand the whole time saying, okay, now do this. Okay, now say this. Okay, next step is this. And our service is free. So I do think it's a really personal choice for folks who either don't have the disposable income or just choose, no, that's not how I want to manage this aspect of my life. I want to really understand how this works and what's happening to me. And that's the gap that we can fill.
Great. Yeah, that's a great service, especially for the people that maybe don't have the budget for some of these expensive services.
And whose
So
identity credentials are just as valuable. It's such
Right.
a fallacy. People think, well, I'm not a high net worth individual. I'm not a high earner. So therefore, what do the identity thieves or the bad actors want with my data, with my information? And I have to tell people, oh, your data is valuable. The fraudster doesn't care about your true financial picture. They don't care if you can't get a good interest rate credit card. They'll apply for payday loans. They don't care what the interest rate is. They're not intending to pay them back. So
Right.
your data is extremely valuable regardless of all of those other circumstances.
Yeah, that's one of the myths that we're going to dispel on this session is that a lot of people don't think that they would fall victim or to something
Mm-hmm.
like this because they're savvy and or they pay attention or maybe they don't think they're worth being a good target. And so we're going to jump into a bunch of interesting things about the data around that, about who's targeted and how bad the problem is and what's going on with data breaches. But first, I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of define for people like what is identity theft and identity fraud, which I guess there's different ways that people can use your identity to commit fraud and
Mm-hmm.
scam you. A lot of this is ultimately financially driven and trying to find some way to make money off of someone else's identity. So can you talk a little bit about like what actually is identity theft? I don't think people really actually understand it. I think in most people's heads it's something like, oh, somebody can steal my social security number and maybe they can like take out credit in my name or maybe they could try to steal money from me. But it's much, much deeper and broader than that. So if you could just kind of help
Mm-hmm.
people understand like what exactly is it and what is going on that these scammers do.
Well, and it's also really confusing because we tend to use identity theft and identity fraud interchangeably when they're two distinct things. And one of the reasons is when the identity theft laws were written a long time ago, we hadn't really made this distinction. So today, right now as it stands, identity theft is the stealing of your identity data. So when there's a data breach, and you've given your data to some organization willingly, and for whatever reason that data is compromised, and now a bad actor has it, that's theft.
And
That's
and that's
identity theft.
and that's all of us. We've all had our social security
Oh,
number leaked many times. So
many
we've all
times
been
over.
part of a data breach where our identity was stolen. And then the next step is okay, they can commit fraud using that and you
Hmm.
can lose money. So let's talk about what happens after they have the information.
Depending on what type of data it is, they're going to find ways to monetize it. And I think you're right. Most people go, oh, it's my social security number and it's going to be used to open financial instruments, financial accounts in my name. And that's true. And that happens. And financial is often the most prevalent type of identity fraud. So that's the misuse piece that occurs in any given year. And it kind of goes back and forth between within the financial industry and within government benefits and services and documents. They flip flop year over year. But that's what most people think of. But your data and your identity credentials are so valuable. If you think about all of the different ways that you use your identity information and data, when it's in the wrong hands, a thief can use it in all of those ways as well. They can use it to get medical goods and services, including prescription drugs and durable medical equipment. They can use it to provide to law enforcement during or after the commission of a crime, anything from speeding tickets to serious felonies. They can use it to apply for government services and benefits, all of those different ways. They can use it to get into accounts, depending on what credentials they have, to get into accounts that you manage. And that can be anything from, again, your financial accounts. But what about like your loyalty accounts, your airline miles? We've seen huge increase in account takeover for airline miles. What about Ticketmaster? We're seeing increases in people having those accounts compromised, and then the tickets that they legitimately have purchased and owned appear on the reseller account, and that money has been converted to another email address. Your social media accounts can then be used by a thief to perpetrate more fraud by having, phony goods for sale, phony listings in Facebook marketplace, phony investment schemes that it looks like you're the one saying, this was a great opportunity, I made all this money, so that your friends will then, quote unquote, invest. There are just so many different ways. All of the ways that you are you and that you prove that you are you, in the wrong hands, someone else can do that too.
Right. And a lot of this you might not even know is going on. So if
Yeah.
like there's certain types of scams where you get a phishing email and people are like, oh, well, I can recognize a phishing email, but your data might have been compromised in a data breach. You don't know. And there could be someone who's, getting some government benefit using your information and you don't even know. So you never got a chance to be savvy and
Hmm.
recognize the scam because you were never even in the middle of the process.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can happen, and there isn't a notification process that you can leverage, and it's just kind of happening in the background. Deposit accounts. We saw that during the pandemic when those bad actors were going and hammering those state systems so that they could take advantage of the enhanced unemployment benefits. They had to have somewhere to get that money. It had to be parked somewhere, deposited somewhere. So they were opening deposit accounts at banks, letting the money come in, and then pushing it out. Well, they weren't opening those deposit accounts in their own name. And, people were finding out then later that they maybe had this checking account at a bank in a state that they didn't live in a financial institution they'd never done business with. And it's now in arrears because they had some fees or withdrew it. That was really the only way that people were finding this out. Because if they keep the account in good standing, it's considered a less risky account. It's not credit. And so we just don't have the same notification process that happens. We don't have this central repository that's easily accessible like we do with the credit reporting agencies. And that's just one example that we don't think about. You're right. There's a million more.
Yeah. So how would someone go about finding out if accounts or different things have been done with their identity that they don't know about? Like how do you figure that out?
I mean, it's really challenging, and it's very hard to know, upfront to do this. Like, I kind of think about it like health. A lot of people go, should I go get a full? This is the big thing, a full body MRI scan, so that I can proactively see what's malfunctioning in my body. And then you have doctors that are like, that's a terrible idea. You're going to get all kinds of false positives and things that really aren't a problem because your body is adjusting and living with it. And I kind of feel the same way about our identity. Instead of trying to wrap your head around, I have to know everything that's gone wrong, and I have to look everywhere and make sure it's never being misused. You're going to drive yourself crazy. That's just not the way the world works anymore. What I want people to do is practice good cyber hygiene, which we can get into in a minute if we want to drill down on that. Practice a level of awareness, paying attention to the incoming alerts and communication, and setting up the settings on a lot of the platforms that you do business with on a regular basis, so that you're getting that incoming information, and then following up on it. For example, a lot of people are getting breach fatigue. They they want to know how their identity is being misused or could potentially be misused, but at the same time they don't want to read that data breach notification because it's the fifth one they've gotten this year. I get that. And I don't it's not like I'm not empathetic, but paying attention to that and at least reading what data was compromised, what about me was compromised, when, and how many other people were, impacted by this. That gives you a pretty good picture of the impact that it's going to have on you and the steps that you can take to try to minimize the risk for that new data that's been breached.
Yeah, I do think people are the, getting fatigued about the breaches because it's like, yeah, it's like every week there's another notification. It was just I got one from Ticketmaster recently. Before that, it was AT&T, and yeah, people are like, well, what can I do? They all send the same letter. It's like, have good passwords, change your password. We're going to give you a year of identity protection for free and
Yeah,
all
and
that stuff.
that's true. It does sound like a broken record, but at the same time, until we start to move the needle and see wider adoption of those things, I'm right along with them in that broken record. I am preaching all of those same things because we're not seeing the adoption rates that we need to see. And just can I just make a comment on Ticketmaster? There's just a couple of things there.
Sure.
And the first one is, look, they had opportunities to have better protections, security and protections. And I think the reason they didn't is one that is sort of industry wide, it's society wide. We do an evaluation, companies do an evaluation of the data that they have and what it's going to cost to protect that data and what is the risk if it's exposed. And I think we're moving beyond this notion that, oh, that's low risk data. That's not really valuable data. So we don't have to put that level of protection against it. And it's just not true anymore. The bad actors have figured out a way to monetize, God, just about everything. And again, I'm talking to you, airlines, because
Yeah.
the
And they can also
miles are
combine it.
valuable.
Yeah. And they can also combine that data with other data. That's the thing that I think people forget is that with a partial data profile, a bad actor can go get the rest of the data from a data broker or another source, and now you have this massive dossier on a person
Hmm.
that's not from a single breach, but from multiple breaches, where it's like, okay, I can get social security numbers from here, I can get credit card numbers from here, I can get address from here, I can get mother's maiden name from here,
Yep.
I can get household information, and these guys are very crafty, and so if you hear about a data breach and you're like, oh well, Ticketmaster didn't really have that much information about me, so I shouldn't be worried. It's like, well, that's going to be combined with other information that could be used against you.
Well, and if the account was so old that you haven't used it in a while, maybe you have a very old, easy password that you've duplicated across all of your accounts. And they did do they sent out the recommendation in the data breach notification letter that you should update your password. And they did do a forced reset. If you went to log in, you were forced to change your password. But as far as I know, and someone, if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, they did not just disband the accounts and say no access. It was the forced reset. So if you had the original password, you could just reset it. So you didn't have to be the actual legitimate owner of that account. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of this misuse now is people going in, the bad actors going in, and they're transferring tickets that have a lot of value and putting them on the marketplace, just taking them out of that digital wallet, and people are left going, they're out the money and they don't have the tickets, and they're distraught.
Yeah, there's so many different clever ways these scammers come up with to steal money. So, okay, well, thanks for helping kind of define like what the different types of fraud are. Um, so let's transition into, there's a couple topics that I think are important to cover. Uh, the first one is the vast majority of people think that they're not going to be a target or they wouldn't fall for one of these scam attempts. And so they're not as concerned. And the data actually shows a different story. And I was wondering if you could share some of that.
I think it's human nature to look at something terrible and as a form of self-protection say that couldn't happen to me. And it doesn't matter, insert reason here, I'm too savvy, I've been educated, I make good decisions, whatever your logical reasoning is behind it. But the reality is, especially when it comes to scams, these bad actors know how to play into our emotional brain. They know how to get us on edge with a sense of urgency, with a sense of a fear of missing out, or just fear in general, fear of consequences, hammering our brain and telling us something is wrong, twisting the truth into very plausible, believable lies that when you're on the outside looking in, you may go, I would never believe that. If I was looking at that, I would never believe that. I kind of see that with romance scams, family members going, I just knew that that person was lying, but the person in the relationship doesn't. And frankly, I mean, if you take the scam piece out of it, how many people looked at a relationship within their family and was like, I knew she was bad for him. I knew he was bad for her. But the person in the relationship can't see it because we're emotionally tied to it. It's a lot of the same thing is going on in our brain when it comes to scams. And so we really have to encourage people, and I'll encourage everyone listening. It is not that certain demographics or age groups are the only ones who are vulnerable. It's not that it can never happen to you. Scams and fraud can happen to anyone. We are all vulnerable. We just have our own unique vulnerabilities. And I think the first step in that is admitting I am vulnerable to this. This is a threat to me. I include myself in this. I don't wake up in the morning going, that could never happen to me because I do this for a living. I know full well that it could absolutely happen to me. And I need to keep that at the forefront of my brain, knowing that we're being deluged with incoming information. And depending on how you navigate the outside world, particularly the online, the digital world, that's where your vulnerabilities are. So your Gen Zers versus your seniors are going to have different types of vulnerabilities, but one is not more vulnerable than the other. I know it's hard to wrap our brains around, but that's the truth, and that's what the data shows us.
Yeah, I remember the latest FTC report showed that actually more younger people were scammed than older people in the last year or so.
Well, if you look at the fraud losses by age from the Consumer Sentinel, it's kind of a bell. And you've got these two bookends. You've got the under 19, which are like 3% of the fraud losses. And we look at losses, not just reports. This happened. I encountered this, but I didn't lose anything from it. So I'm talking about
Right.
losses where I encountered this and I actually believed it enough that I lost money. So you've got about 3% on that under 19 group, and then you've only got 4% on the 80 and over group. So they're the really small bookends. And then when you look in the middle, it's only a few percentage points difference between all those 10-year benchmarks. So, and yes, I'm looking at a chart right now, so I get these numbers right. But the 30 to 39-year-old age group, it was 18% of the complaints that were received by the FTC were received from that age group. But also the 60 to 69-year-old age group,
Right.
18%. It's
So
exactly the same.
it's fairly consistent with the overall population
It
demographic.
really is. The deltas aren't big. Like you've got this one group that's just by far and away super vulnerable. And this stands true even when you start. I'm talking about 2023 numbers from their most recent Sentinel book, but you can go back over a decade or more, and it really rings true. It shifts a little bit in there, but there's no big hockey stick or peak with all the other ones being low. It does this bell every year.
Yeah. So, what is the average financial loss from these various crimes? And I know that it varies widely. You hear stories about people losing their whole life savings, and maybe it's a pair of tickets that were only worth $100. But is there any
Hmm.
sort of numbers around that?
Well, again, I go back to the FTC. Bureau of Justice Statistics also has some good numbers. In the reality is they're all talking about median numbers. So you've got a couple of $100 the younger, and then the median loss I think for seniors this year I think it was 1,400. So that sounds not terrible, and it makes sense, right? Younger people don't necessarily have the resources to lose, but those are like median numbers. That's the piece you have to look at. We talk to people we're seeing the ends kind of increase and the middle gets squished in our data. And we'll be publishing that in just a couple of weeks, where we're seeing the smaller dollar losses are kind of growing, that under 500 bucks.
Yes, people don't
The
notice.
or it's an easier decision to make to part with the money. You're
Right.
not being quite as thoughtful if something is $50 and you're like, well, I'm not sure about it, but if I'll take the chance, but if I lose it, it's not necessarily going to kill me. Um, and then you get in the middle, that couple of $1,000, that's getting more compacted. But then we're seeing growth in the over $5,000. We're seeing that, and that's the ITRC data. But again, these are all sort of median numbers. There are people who are losing their life savings. There are people who are losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even over $1 million. We have actually taken calls from people who have lost over $1 million. Most of them are older people, retirees, and it's their nest egg, it's their retirement savings that they're losing, and it's through a variety of different types of schemes and scams, but it's huge, huge dollar
Do you
amounts.
do you have any examples you could share of like how like what were the events that led up to someone accidentally losing $1 million or $100,000? Like what happened? How did that happen?
There's a couple different ones that come to mind. The first one was a lottery scam, and it was that was several $100,000. This person was being told that they had won all of this money, and then it was, well, you have to pay the taxes. And for anybody listening, that is not true. Yes, you lottery winnings are taxed, but you pay the taxes out of the winnings, not up front. But this person didn't know that. And so then it was, you've got to pay this fee. And then it was, here's this other added. They just, look, the scammers will keep asking for money until you stop giving it to them, and they will make every excuse. So it wasn't until he drained all of the money that he had and they were pushing him to start opening credit cards that he got very scared and thought, this isn't coming through. But it was under the promise that you're gonna give us this couple of $100,000 in order to get $10 million. And so
Wow.
that was the hook for that person. Hope, oh, I can do this. And he was an older man, so hope, I can do this for my family. Those types of things. We had another one that was an imposter scam, a law enforcement imposter scam, where this person was told, this is the Department of Homeland Security. We are investigating a case against you for child pornography and sexual imagery, money laundering, and identity theft. Now, during the course of our investigation, we determined that it isn't actually you, it's someone using your identity. So you're the victim.
Mm,
Now we want to help you. We need to help you. And the thieves are very, very close to getting access to all of your assets. They are pretending to be you. We can't protect you unless you move these assets to this new financial institution where we can protect you. And they talked
wow.
them into, it was a couple, but it was a woman that did a lot of the transactions, talked them into moving their money into an overseas bank, into this other
Wow.
account. So they moved all of their assets into this overseas account because they thought it was their government protecting them from disaster, when it turns out, they were talking to thieves, talking to scammers.
Wow. And what did those scammers need to get that started? Was it just a phone call? And they just call a bunch of people, and as soon as someone starts to engage, they get the rest of the information they need through the, I guess, scam process of
It's a little
cultivating this
hard to
person?
tell. Theoretically, yes, all they would need is a phone number. If they're that good and they could talk people out of beginning to compromise more details about
Or maybe
themselves.
your name too, like,
I
hi,
would think that
Mary.
they would
Yeah.
have some basic information about who you are, how old you are, maybe where you used to work, where you live, um, that type of information, which, again, by the way, easily discoverable either through the dark web or even through purchasing that kind of demographic background data
Yeah, that's one of the
online.
things that we part of our service is to help reduce the number of data brokers that have your personal data so that you're less likely to have it easily purchased.
Hmm.
And that kind of data does have things like who your family members are, your social media profiles, where you worked, your contact information. So you can call someone, get them on the phone, and really make them believe that you know them and
You make the
that,
case that you're
yeah,
law enforcement and you have access to all of these special law enforcement datas that give us this kind of information, and that absolutely works. I mean, even on the kind of lower dollar amount scams, we've had people say, well, I thought it was my cable company calling me. They called, I picked up, they said, Bob, this is XYZ cable company. We need to verify your account. And I said, well, how do I know you're you? And they said, gave me my full name, my date of birth, my service address, and the last four of my cable account. They had so much about me already that it sounded legitimate that I actually was their customer. That kind of information very easy to find. So it's
yeah,
that, if it's this fallacy that we have, that if you know that much about me, you must be allowed to know it, and we have to disabuse ourselves of that.
yeah, for sure. I have a couple stories I'll share that are along those lines. I have an elderly family member who got one of those pop-ups on his computer that said, "Your computer has been infected. Uh,
Hmm.
please call Microsoft at this number." And he called it, and the person that answered the phone was pretending that they were actually from Microsoft.
Hmm.
And he got this relative to install some software on his computer so that he could
Like a
help him.
keystroke logger, or
Uh, I'm not sure, but he was ultimately saying that all of your accounts had been compromised because of this virus that's on your computer. Don't worry, we're going to help you clear this
mhm.
up. And uh, ultimately, what they were trying to do was similar to the offshore transfer that you had mentioned. It looks like you might be reconnecting. Did I lose you?
I didn't lose you. I could hear you.
Oh,
Huh.
okay. My video said reconnecting on yours, but I'll just start that section over. We'll just cut
Okay.
that out. So they were trying to get him to transfer his money to a different place because they said that his accounts had all been compromised. And one of the interesting things that they did was they said, do not talk to anyone. Don't contact law enforcement. You know, your phone has been tapped. Don't contact any relatives. You can't trust anyone. And so they isolated him.
Yep.
And he didn't even want to tell his wife because he was like scared uh, because he didn't know what to do. And so this was the trusted solution provider, who obviously wasn't trustworthy, tr- isolating him, telling him not to talk to anyone, and trying to get him to transfer his money. In this case, they were trying to get him to set up a cryptocurrency account and transfer all of his
Of course
money.
they were. Of
Yeah.
course they were.
And I think he finally told his wife, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And then you know, they eventually disconnected from this person, but they almost got him. So that was one
Isn't it?
story.
It's so despicable to use our altruism, um, like again, to weaponize the good deeds. As someone who runs an organization that's built on philanthropy and altruism, all of the things that we do are free to the public. It's that whole. It's starting to sound too good to be true, because people tell you they're trying to help you, and then they end up doing, something like that. But I think the big message for your listeners and what they need to hear is, anytime you have someone, I don't care who that authority figure is, trying to isolate you, telling you not to tell anybody, walk away. That is just, no legitimate law enforcement agency, financial institution, company is going to tell you you have to keep this secret. They just aren't. So if you hear that, it's a lie, just like you have to pay the taxes for your lottery winnings up front. It's just a bold-faced lie.
Yeah, exactly. I get targeted. I mean, everyone gets a lot of emails. As a cybersecurity professional, sometimes in a sandbox environment, I'll actually open these emails and see what the scam is. A recent one that's new for me is I got a PDF, which, by the way, never open a PDF you don't trust.
Don't open attachments.
I did this in a protected environment to study the scam. Um, but what this person had done was they put a picture of my house, which you can get on Google Maps. You can go to Street View and you get a picture of anyone's house. So I had a picture of my house and my name and address, and then he had this letter that was telling me that he has hacked all my stuff, that he's compromised everything, and that he's been spying on me. And then he said that I've been doing a bunch of bad things online that he's recorded and is going to release it, and that he wanted me to send him like $9,000. I mean, I don't know why I think it's a man. It could be any gender, but this person wanted me to.
Dude, let's keep it real. It's a bot. It's a
Yeah,
bot that wrote that and is
yeah.
yeah, sending
But
that.
they wanted me to send them $9,000 in Bitcoin to get them to go away, and I could see that being really scary because like when you send someone a picture of your house, it's like I'm watching you. I looked at it and recognized that it was a street view from Google Maps. So I actually went to Google Maps to look at the latest street view of my house and
Yeah.
noticed that the same car was there and it was the same picture. So I was like, all right, this dude actually hasn't been outside my house. But it gives you pause. It's like, what? That makes you very uncomfortable to get, a letter that shows a picture of your house.
Well, and it's unnerving. You remember when I said they play on your emotions and they play on, fear and sense of urgency? Well, and I've seen the ones, they've been going around forever, but it's all the ones that have to do with sexual activity. So I
Hmm.
know this is a family friendly podcast, but this is real and this is happening. And so it's these threats of, oh, I know you visit these bad websites and
Yeah,
see what you
exactly.
do to yourself, and I've taped you, which, I mean, this is something that our sexuality, our sexual behavior, it's deeply personal. And the thought of someone just releasing that out into online into the world is extremely disturbing. So it's unnerving. It gets people to go, oh my God, what's happening? Now, the reality is 99% of them aren't real. There are some there, we have issues with revenge porn, but most of the time that's not through hacking.
Yeah, somebody
That's through that's through um I don't even want to call them legitimate, the consent based recordings or photographs to be taken but not to be released.
Right.
And that's where you see a lot more of that. So I want people to be very leery and understand that there's a lot of things that technology can do. There's a lot going on in the background, but at the same time, a lot of these scams are much more they're about hacking your brain, not hacking your computer.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
relying a lot more on that.
Yeah, sometimes that's called social engineering. But yeah, it's all about just using people to get stuff. But yeah, I mean, so one lesson for everyone watching or listening is it's if somebody tells you that they have compromised all your systems and they have recordings and audio and they're going to release it all or they're listening or they're watching, it's extremely unlikely that that's actually the case. And even if it is, you still should talk to law enforcement. Don't ever let any of these scammers isolate you and say, "Oh, don't. I'm watching you. So if you try to contact law enforcement, I'm going to release all of this information." They don't really have it, and so, and even if they do, you still need to contact law enforcement.
Or even, with the pop-ups, like when your relative got the pop-up, contact somebody else. Even if you don't want to call the police, which I wouldn't on that pop-up, um, call someone. I have gotten those pop-ups. And one of them was so disturbing. It was out of the blue and so loud. And there's
Hmm.
nothing you can do. You can't hit escape. There is nothing you can do other than shut the power down and do a hard reboot. Nothing. Now, I mean, I obviously knew it was a scam, but I was surprised at how loud it was and how there was nothing I could do but turn it off. Of course, I called my IT department and was like, was I compromised in some other way? How were they able to do this pop up? And it was like, no, we did a check. So it was random. I was on Chrome looking some stuff up. And I wasn't even on shady websites because that's not how we roll. But it it can be unnerving. It can be very disturbing. But don't let that rattle you. You know, if I and it's reminding me. I mean, you're giving me such a good reminder. My 81-year-old mother, online a lot. I just need a reminder about the tech support scams and some of the other ones that can be really scary and disturbing, and just remind her to call me. She's pretty good. She'll even, like, when she gets the email, she'll be like, another one for your files. You know, she knows it's a scam. Here's, or a text message. Here's another one. This is what they're doing now, coming after old ladies. Uh, And so she knows she's got me, but it's a good reminder, not just for anyone in that age group who's listening, but for those of you that have people in that age group in your life, to remind them of these things, because they're probably, maybe they're not listening to this podcast.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Cool. So obviously there's some of the things that we've talked about is, vigilance, which is just being aware, and being skeptical, and you know
And
when you
asking
are
for help.
yeah, and asking for help. Um, are there any preventive things people can do just to like reduce the amount of, I guess, at bats scammers are taking against them, like, or just reduce the risk of being targeted in the first place?
I don't think there's a lot you can do to reduce your risk of being targeted. There's a lot you can do to reduce your risk of being, it's like the theft versus the fraud, right? There's not a whole lot you can do prevention of the theft if you're going to be engaged online. You could pull back and reduce your digital footprint. That could definitely have an impact. Um, you can do things to reduce your digital footprint, of course, but I just think this is the world we live in. We're going to be targeted. Um, you can also do things like set up alerts so that you do it. That's more about knowing if someone is using your information without your knowledge, so that you can address it quickly. Doing things like setting up, it's good cyber hygiene, um, complex passwords, setting up multi-factor authentication, setting up settings, going into your settings and making sure that they are both privacy centric and that you're getting alerts, opting into multi-factor authentication even when it's not mandatory, and again, asking for help. I think that's a big one, um, especially for those two bookends, the very young and our older folks, because our older folks don't want to be seen as incompetent and they can't manage their own affairs, and that they're going to be told, oh, you don't get to manage your own money or online, you have to have somebody taking care of you. And younger people, for largely the same reason, being told they're not competent, they can't manage their own lives, and not having the independence that they want to launch. But I want to encourage them. One of the biggest signs of competence is knowing what you don't know and saying, oh, with this, I need help. So I'm going to reach out to a trusted resource and ask some questions and get the help I need and get the guidance I need to make good decisions about this particular situation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's actually, thanks for all that great advice. I do think that reducing your digital footprint does help. It reduces, what you might call your attack surface, which is the number
Mm-hmm.
of different places that your data can be found. I don't necessarily think you have to use the internet less. What you do, there's tools like Privacy Hawk, shameless self promotion, that people can use uh, to help automate identifying, because all the places that have your data, and you have privacy rights to request that companies
Mm-hmm.
delete your data if they no longer need it. And what we found is that if you actually go back, so part of the hardest part is people don't remember who they gave their data to.
Mm-hmm.
So we built some automation that scans your inbox, because that's where the vast majority of your digital footprint can be found. And on average, we identify 400 or 500 companies that people legally gave their data to because they interacted in some way, whether they signed up for an account or bought something or set up a service or installed an app, or maybe it's just a newsletter. All that stuff adds up, and now you got 500 companies that have your data, and maybe 80 or 90% of them you don't use anymore, but they still have your data. Like, to use Ticketmaster as an example, if you bought some tickets at Ticketmaster 5 years ago and you haven't used it since, guess what? They still have your profile. They didn't delete it. They've got all that data. And so when they got breached, even though you haven't used them in years, now you've become a victim of identity theft and your data is now on the dark web. But in 20 different states, which in the United States, which covers half the US population, and more states are passing privacy laws, you have some very fundamental rights. And one of them is to request that a company deletes your data. And the problem is it's very time consuming. So there's tools out there that you can use to automate that, but just deleting your data from places that don't need it is something that I'm a big fan of, which helps. It's not going to, there's no solution that's going to completely eliminate this, but we're talking about reducing your risk.
Right.
Some other things that I think are important, and the stats of how many people do this are shockingly low. One of them is to freeze your credit. My latest research shows that fewer than 20% of people have frozen their credit. And it makes applying for credit slightly more inconvenient. It's 5 minutes to freeze.
I was going to say slightly.
Yeah.
Slightly.
It's 5 minutes to freeze all 3 bureaus and 5 minutes to unfreeze it. How often do you apply for credit? Like a few times a year? And what that does is it completely locks down your credit, so nobody can take out credit in your name. There's still other types of fraud that you could fall victim to, but nobody's going to be able to go buy an iPhone using your credit or take out a credit card in your name and charge a bunch of stuff.
Get a mortgage.
Get a
car.
mortgage. Completely locked down unless you unfreeze it, and it's very difficult to unfreeze. You'd have to be severely. They'd have to get access to your login and two-factor authentication in order to do it. And so few people have done it. So that's, I think, a very easy thing that you can do that's free that helps lock down that kind of fraud. Another thing that I recommend is at least once a week, if not more frequently, just go look through all the transactions in your debit and credit cards and just make sure you recognize all of them. And if you don't recognize one, go try to figure out where it came from. And if you think that it might have been fraudulent, contact your bank so that they can lock down that card, and then they'll reverse that charge and give you your money back. But the problem is, what happens is if you wait too long and you don't catch it in time, or maybe you never catch it, and then you just lost that money. So, somebody charged $50 or $60 and it just flew under the radar, and somebody scammed you out of $60. So that's another important thing, is to just like monitor your accounts and keep an eye on things. Look for weird things that you don't recognize. I think that's helpful too. And another shockingly low, simple thing people can do, but has low usage, is password managers. I think it's something like 15% or fewer of the population is using a password manager, or they kind of use it because like your iPhone has one. And I think
the excuses of I don't want to pay for that can be over, because they're being embedded into trustworthy platforms, because your iPhone already has that.
Yeah, it starts out and it starts out as feeling very inconvenient because you have to go change your password in all these different places, but you can kind of chip away at it over time. Like, do the most important accounts, like your bank, your social media, your Amazon or whatever. It sounds inconvenient because you have to have all these different passwords, but the password managers have apps that are built into your phone, and when you go to log in, you don't have to remember all these different passwords. It just auto fills it for you, and it also auto creates a password for any new account. So I think most people are still reusing the same password or some variation of it, and that's very dangerous, because if one of these hundreds of companies that you're reusing this password with gets hacked, now the hackers can then use those credentials to log into your other stuff and compromise those accounts. So I do think it's worth the extra effort to get a password manager, and there are free ones. The one that you can get if you're using an Apple device is free. Google Chrome has a free,
Hmm.
built-in password manager. So
Well,
those are some
now
of the
we're moving
things.
on
Yeah,
to passkeys.
yeah,
So we can't even get people, although we're seeing actually really good numbers in adoption of passkeys. I think because it's so easy,
yeah,
because it's so intuitive.
yeah. And that kind of locks down the login to that browser and that device, and then you never have to log in again from that browser and that device because it's got like a key that's locked down. It's kind of sandboxed. But yeah, that's cool technology.
We're fans.
Cool. Um, so you guys put out data breach reports regularly. Anything you want to call out from any of your latest reports that you think our listeners and viewers would be interested in?
Well, with the data breach report, we release that every January, and so this year will be no different. We are keeping an eye on it. The trend line for us, I don't think last year was a record breaking number by a huge magnitude, and I don't think we're going to break that. Something monumental would have to happen for us to surpass last year's record, but it's still going to be the numbers are still going to be extremely high, and the victim count is definitely high, but we have a couple, again, large scale breaches. Look at Ticketmaster. It's north of 300 million accounts just in the US, which, I mean, we know there's duplicates in there. That to your point earlier about did you have an old Ticketmaster account? You probably had an old one and then you recreated a new one with a new email, because there's a lot of duplicates if we're north of 300 million in the accounts just in the US. So that's kind of the state of data breaches. The We did recently release our trends and identity report, which I would encourage people to look at. That's where we look at the types of scams, fraud, and identity crime that we're hearing about in the call center. And we saw some significant growth in job scams. We also saw the toll road scams kind of peaked. There was this big wave. And so we're seeing more scams that seem to be, the hook is more regional. I think they're segmenting by area code, frankly, instead of like zip code, because these are all coming through your phone. And then our cyber report, which is our consumer impact and business impact report, where we look at what are the true harms caused to consumers, and what's going on with victims, what are the or with businesses, what are the root causes, how are these attacks occurring, and what are businesses experiencing. That's coming out in just a couple of weeks, and I think that will be very compelling data, particularly if you are um, in this industry and trying to make a case for investing more resources. And a lot of times the conversation is, well, what's the harm? What's the worst thing that could happen? Here is the data that shows you what the worst thing could happen is, and it's a compelling case for devoting more resources towards these activities, both for your organization but also for yourself.
Yeah, yeah. Just looking at the 2023 breach report, and the numbers are in a similar order of magnitude every year for the last few years. They might go up or down 10, 20%, but we're talking thousands of breaches, hundreds of millions of victims. There's more victims than people in the United States, which means most of us have been in multiple
Multiple
breaches,
times.
multiple times, and varying levels of information has uh, been been leaked. But yeah, I mean, no matter how big or secure an organization is, none of them are foolproof.
Hmm.
Like whether it's a cable company or or a mobile phone company or even government organizations, like even like the CIA and NSA and State Department sometimes get hacked, and so um,
Well, it goes
it
back it
yeah,
goes back to your overall uh not theme, but your message earlier that we started with, is that everybody's vulnerable, and that includes organizations. And these the misconceptions that, oh, it's not going to happen to us. We we have to have more conversations about that, and it's happening to other businesses, it's happening to other government entities, not us. And it's the same thing with the scams, people thinking, oh, it's not going to happen to me. And if we have time, I do have one more interesting report and tidbit of data that
Yeah,
I
go
just
for it.
I was fascinated by this. It's by IPX 1031. It's part of Fidelity, and according to their data, this is a 2024 report. Um, one in every three Americans have been scammed in the last 12 months.
Wow.
That's quite compelling. Um, and when you look at the demographics around the dollar losses, so what they did was they took the average loss of $1,600, which to me is quite high. That's very different from the FTC data, but on average, the $1,600 loss, 37% were Gen Z, 26% were millennials, 32% were Gen X, 38% of baby boomers. That's really across the board. I mean, those
Yeah.
deltas are not that much. And the last piece that I thought was so interesting was that 69% of all of these people that they surveyed that had this experience still believe that it's more young people falling for scams in 2024 than anybody else. That's the
Young
belief.
people. So
Yep.
older people think it's young people falling for scams?
Young people think it's young people, and older people think it's young people. It's this shift. We have done this. Every time I read the stats and then I read the belief systems, for years it was seniors, seniors, seniors. Seniors are falling for more scams. And for a while that was true. Really, with the onset of technology, that was more true, but it leveled out pretty quickly to this kind of bell curve. But everybody believed, oh, seniors, more vulnerable. They're falling for scams. Well, then we got some data points a couple of years ago. It was like, oh, younger people. Now it's happening to younger people. Well, they're digital natives. They're all online. They're connected more. So they're falling for more scams. So now, even though the data says, no, not really, we're all kind of very close in the rates. Now 69% of people believe, oh no, it's all young people falling for scams now. We
Oh,
just we have these belief
yeah.
systems that are not based in reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I think there's a relative, uh, I guess, there's a relative harm that is the same for everyone. So, like, if you're Gen Z and you're living paycheck to paycheck, $1,600 is a lot of money. And maybe if you're older and been saving for a long time, you're more wealthy, maybe you might lose 5 or 10% of your net worth to a scam, and maybe that's a lot more money. But it's just as impactful for
Oh
someone
yeah.
in Gen Z to have like their small amount of money that they have wiped out, and now they don't know how they're going to pay rent next month. So,
Yeah, it's not the
sixteen hundred
dollar
dollars.
amount.
Yeah,
It's the percentage relative to your resources that you have to
right.
look at. That's what causes the impact. So even relatively small hard dollar amounts can have a huge impact on somebody if they don't have the resources to recover versus some of these much bigger dollar amounts that we may see where people go, "Oh, that hurts, but I still have enough." That was only 10% of my net worth versus somebody with a much lower dollar amount that's going, that was 80% of my net worth. It's
Yeah,
all about the resources you have to recover, and not, but those large dollar amounts, those are the ones that always take our breath away, right? You hear somebody lost $2 million and you just go, oh, I can't believe it.
yeah,
But then they go, yeah, well, I still have 10 million in the bank. So it sucks, but I'm going to be okay. And then you hear
yeah,
somebody lost $1,500 and they go, that is every penny that I had.
yeah,
That is every penny that I had, and I will not be able to feed myself, shelter myself, clothe myself, or get to work next month.
yeah. And there's a myth that I think a lot of people have that we should dispel related to these financial crimes, which is that if you fall victim to a scam, in many cases, the way that the money is stolen, it's not reimbursable back to you by the
Oh, yeah.
bank. Um, so if you enable the scammer to get the money through getting tricked, the bank does not have to reimburse you, and very often they will not. If you wire money to some offshore account and that money's gone, the banks have been fighting
Yeah.
those challenges and
Auth-
winning.
yeah, it's authorized versus unauthorized. That's how they define it. So if it was unauthorized, meaning somebody had your credentials or your information and conducted transactions, but you knew nothing about it, you had nothing to do with it, that's reimbursable. If you authorize the transaction, but you didn't realize who you were talking to. Well, I thought I was talking to the Department of Homeland Security, or I thought I was talking to my bank, or I thought I was talking to the love of my life, or, romance scam. The banks are not, they're not obligated in all circumstances. There are some, and there's some that they are voluntarily doing now, sets of circumstances. But if you authorized it, they're not obligated, and they people are going, well, I did it, but I had a really good reason and it was a mistake. That's not necessarily enough to compel a big financial institution to say, oh, okay, we're gonna give you your money back. At the end of the day, in a lot of these situations, the only person that wins, because the banks lose whether they reimburse you and lose financially, or they don't and lose reputationally. The victim loses in a lot of ways, whether or not. If they're reimbursed, they still had their trust abused, and if they're not reimbursed, they're hurting financially. The only winner is the bad actor. They're
Yep.
enriched and they're walking away. So the status quo is truly broken, and we have to find better ways and better interventions to stop the money from getting to the fraudster. We've got to stop it before it gets there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, okay, well, it's been really awesome talking to you. Any closing thoughts or anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, I think we've gone far over, but you and I could talk forever. Um, just, folks, if you need help, you can always reach out to the ITRC. We're like the AAA for identity. When something goes wrong, remember you have us in your back pocket.
Great. Well, thanks for the work that you're doing, and thanks for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It was my pleasure.